Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're investigating a massive macroeconomic mystery. We're looking at the dramatic rise and fall of the Soviet economy between 1928 and 1985. We're talking about a period that literally reshaped the globe, transforming an underdeveloped, rural nation into an absolute industrial powerhouse. It's this wild story of staggering ambition, highly questionable statistics, and ultimately, some really severe foundational cracks.
But we really have to start with a paradox. How exactly does an economy that built a modern industrial state and matched the US in military might no less suddenly just hit a brick wall? I mean, for decades, Western economists were genuinely sitting around wondering when the Soviet Union would overtake the West. But instead of an overtaking, the engine just totally stalled out.
For over half a century, the annual average growth rate of the Soviet gross national product set at a really impressive 4.2%. Now, when you sustain that kind of number over decades, it's an undeniable marker of modern economic growth. They were completely rebuilding a nation's infrastructure from the ground up, and those early numbers absolutely reflected a massive, massive surge.
But then came the drop-off. We see this really sharp decline from a booming 5.7% in the 1950s, plummeting all the way down to a sluggish 2.0% by the early 1980s. So over 30 years, the growth rate was more than halved. The economic engine was quite literally running out of steam, and the gap between the Soviet economy and Western economies actually started widening all over again.
So to unravel this whole mystery, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The Soviet growth record, 2. The extensive growth strategy, 3. The data reliability problem, 4. The shadow second economy, and finally, number 5. Can the trend reverse? Let's jump right in.
Starting off with Section 1, the Soviet growth record.
To really understand the fall, we absolutely have to respect the sheer scale of their initial catch-up. Back in 1928, the Soviet economy was only about a quarter the size of the US economy. Fast forward to 1977, it had pushed all the way up to 60%. Actually, their GNP per capita peaked relative to the US in 1975 at 52%. I mean, that is a staggering, incredibly rapid climb.
Which brings us to Section 2, the extensive growth strategy. So, how exactly did they fuel this early, massive boom?
Well, the answer lies in something called extensive growth. Basically, think of it like throwing more workers and more machines at a problem, rather than taking the time to invent a better, more efficient machine. It relies entirely on just mobilizing raw resources, shoveling more coal, building more steel mills, and physically moving millions of peasants from the countryside straight into urban factories.
And this is wild. Over the entire 1928 to 1985 period, a massive 76% of their total GNP growth came purely from just adding more inputs. Actual efficiency improvements, like working smarter, not harder, only contributed 24% to that growth. So they weren't exactly making major leaps in innovation. They were really just exhausting a previously untapped pool of raw capital and human labor.
Now, with so much focus on heavy industry and this incredibly massive defense burden, everyday consumption lagged way, way behind. Fixed investments were eating up to 29% of the economy. And defense spending, that climbed to an estimated 17% by the early 80s, which is roughly 3 times the burden carried by the United States at the time. So the ultimate loser in this whole equation was the everyday Soviet consumer, whose slice of the economic pie just steadily shrank.
Moving on to Section 3, the data reliability problem. Now you might be wondering, how do we even know these statistics when information in a centrally planned economy is so strictly controlled? Well, Western studies, like this really comprehensive 1990 RAND report, basically had to act as economic detectives to piece together the real picture. Because official information was so frequently withheld or, let's be honest, distorted for propaganda, researchers had to scrub, re-estimate, and cross-reference demographic data, international trade figures, and even émigré interviews just to figure out what was actually happening on the ground.
The crazy thing is, the system inherently encouraged factories to lie. Because managers were rewarded based on hitting these super rigid central quotas, there was an overwhelming incentive to just inflate production stats. It was totally a house of cards built on distorted data. Meanwhile, the state completely blacked out defense spending figures and even suppressed embarrassing social realities, like a genuinely tragic rising infant mortality rate in the 1970s.
This takes us to Section 4, the shadow second economy. Because the official state numbers didn't reflect reality, the everyday lives of citizens really didn't either.
Since the official plan was completely failing to supply basic consumer goods, an entire informal shadow economy sprouted up just to fill the void. The economist Gregory Grossman actually called this the second economy. These were activities done for private gain, knowing full well it was against the law. I mean, think about it. While the state was busy churning out tanks, ordinary people were turning to the black market just to find a decent pair of shoes, some fresh food, or even a plumber.
So, to survive, citizens relied on this thing called blat. It was a sprawling, corrupt network of favors that essentially became the true lifeblood of everyday consumer survival. And it wasn't just about slipping someone some cash under the table. It was this incredibly complex system of, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. You know, like you help me get building materials from your factory, and my cousin the butcher will save you a good cut of meat. It was an informal sector that literally kept society functioning when the official store shelves were completely bare.
But how do we actually prove this shadow market existed? Well, economists did what they do best. They followed the money. Researchers compared what Soviet citizens legally brought home against what they were depositing in savings or buying at the store. And the disparity was absolutely massive. People were spending way more than they legally earned. So the math completely proved the rapid expansion of this massive underground economy.
And that brings us to our final section. Number 5. Can the trend reverse? By the 1980s, the system was clearly failing. But, could it have been stopped?
The reality is, the core strategy was doomed to exhaust itself. Once you run out of extra people and raw materials to just throw into the factories, your growth simply stops. And labor growth was nearing zero at this point. On top of that, the intense top-down pressure to catch up to the West at lightning speed created these massive production bottlenecks. They were prioritizing hitting rigid, immediate quotas over making the flexible, long-term investments that you actually need for real innovation.
And this led to a desperate final pivot. Mikhail Gorbachev realized the economy was totally suffocating under central control. So he attempted to inject some market dynamism into this incredibly rigid system, forcing state enterprises to become self-financing. He also pushed for glasnost, or openness, finally realizing that a modern economy absolutely requires the free flow of accurate information to function.
So I want to leave you with this thought. As economists like Gregory Grossman predicted, the shadow economy undermined the command system from the inside out. But could any top-down regime survive the openness required for true innovation? The very things required to spark the information revolution, decentralization, accurate data, and free exchange, were direct threats to the authoritarian control of the state itself. It's such a fascinating historical lesson on the absolute limits of throwing mere resources at an economy without fostering the actual freedom required for genuine innovation. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.